A man stumbled through the forest carrying something that was dying. The snow came down in thick, relentless curtains, swallowing the pine trees, whole erasing the trails, burying the world under a silence so heavy it pressed against the lungs like a hand. The temperature had dropped well below zero, the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. It entered through the skin and settled into the marrow and whispered that everything warm was a lie. Caleb Mercer moved through that cold the way a man moves through a nightmare he cannot wake from. One boot in front of the other. Arms locked around the body of a large German shepherd whose blood had soaked through his coat and frozen against his chest in dark, crystallized patches. Her breathing was shallow. Each exhale came as a faint, ragged whisper that fogged the air between them for barely a second before the wind stole it away. He had promised he would not come back without her. He had promised two tiny creatures trembling beside a fire that he would bring their mother home. And now, somewhere between the ridge and the frozen creek bed, with the storm closing in and the light failing and every muscle in his body screaming, Caleb Mercer understood that promises made to the helpless carry a weight that no training, no discipline, no battlefield courage can fully prepare a man to bear. The dog in his arms let out a sound, not a whimper, something quieter. Something that lived in the space between breathing and not breathing. Her amber eyes opened just a sliver, catching the last gray light filtering through the canopy. She looked at him, not with fear, not with pain, with something that felt terribly, impossibly close to trust. "Stay with me," he whispered through cracked lips. "Just a little longer." The forest did not answer. The wind did not ease. The snow kept falling, and the man kept walking, and somewhere behind them in the darkening woods, something else was moving too. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This moment, this desperate march through a frozen wilderness with a dying mother dog pressed against his heart, did not begin here. It began 5 days earlier. On a road that no one should have been driving, with a suitcase that no one was meant to find. Before we go back, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. Because this story found its way to you for a reason, and I believe you will understand why before it ends. Let us go back 5 days. To the morning, everything changed. Winter had come to northern Vermont the way grief comes to a person who has been holding it at bay for too long. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once in a single overwhelming surge that left everything buried and still. Snow covered the hills around Millersfield in deep, unbroken sheets. It clung to the rooftops of the old colonial houses along Birch Lane. It bent the branches of the white pines that lined Highway 42 until they bowed like mourners at a funeral. The air held the sharp metallic taste of ice, and the sky hung low and gray, as though the clouds themselves were too exhausted to rise. Millersfield was the kind of town that time moved through slowly. A single main street with a hardware store, a diner called Rosie's with red vinyl booths and coffee that had tasted the same since 1987, a post office where Eleanor Finch had worked the counter for 31 years and still remembered every resident's birthday. In summer, the town softened. Wildflowers grew along the creek beds, children rode bicycles past the covered bridge on Old Mill Road, and the hills turned the kind of green that made people stop their cars just to look. But in winter, Millersfield contracted. It pulled inward. The streets emptied, the windows fogged. The silence between houses grew wider, deeper, until each home became its own small island surrounded by white. It was into this silence that Caleb Mercer drove each morning, not because he had anywhere to go, but because stillness had become something he could no longer bear. He was 38 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, built with the kind of dense, functional strength that came from years of military conditioning rather than any interest in appearance. His face was angular, the jawline strong beneath a short, neatly trimmed beard that had gone from dark brown to flecked with early gray in the span of 2 years. His hair was cut close on the sides, slightly longer on top, the way he had worn it in the service, because some habits outlast the reasons that created them. But it was his eyes that told the real story of Caleb Mercer. They were steel blue, steady, the kind of eyes that could hold a room or read a landscape or meet a threat without flinching. But beneath that steadiness lived something else, a weariness that never fully lifted, a distance that appeared even in moments of closeness, as though some part of him was always standing watch over a perimeter only he could see. He had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 12 years of deployments to places whose names he could not speak in casual conversation, 12 years of missions conducted in darkness, in dust, in the suffocating heat of territories where every shadow could kill. He had been decorated. He had been respected. He had been the kind of soldier that other soldiers trusted with their lives. And then, on a night, he replayed behind his eyelids, more often than he would ever admit, a wall had collapsed in a village whose name he still could not say without his hands beginning to shake. And the sound that followed, or rather the silence that followed, had broken something inside him that no surgeon could reach and no metal could repair. He came home. That was the word they used. Home. As though the concept still applied to a man who flinched at car doors slamming and could not sleep without a light on and had forgotten how to sit in a room with other people without mapping every exit. He returned to Millersfield because his grandfather's cabin still stood at the edge of the woods past the old lumber road, and because it was the only place left on earth where no one expected him to be anything. The cabin was modest, timber frame, a brick chimney that leaned slightly to the east, windows that rattled when the wind came hard from the north. Inside, it smelled of pine smoke and old wool and the particular quiet of a space that had not heard laughter in a very long time. Caleb had not changed much since moving in. A few books on the shelf, a wool blanket folded over the back of the couch, a photograph of his grandfather standing beside the creek, holding a fishing rod, squinting into the sun. That was it. The cabin of a man who had not yet decided whether he was staying. Each morning followed the same pattern. Coffee black from a dented percolator on the stove. Boots laced in silence. The truck started with a cough and a groan, and then the slow, aimless drive through the frozen countryside that served as the closest thing Caleb had to a ritual. He drove Highway 42 most often, a narrow 2-lane road that wound through the pines and followed the curve of Miller's Creek before climbing toward the ridgeline. In summer, it was scenic. In winter, it was desolate. And desolate, for reasons Caleb did not examine too closely, felt like the only kind of honest. This particular morning was colder than most. The thermometer outside the cabin had read 9 degrees at dawn, and the wind chill drove it lower still. Snow fell in slow, patient spirals from a sky that looked like it had forgotten the sun existed. The wipers on the truck moved in a steady rhythm, clearing the glass just enough to reveal the road ahead in brief, blurred glimpses. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel. His jaw was set. His breathing was even. His mind was doing what it always did on these morning drives, circling, returning, replaying. The therapist at the VA in Burlington had called it rumination. Caleb called it the weather inside his head. Some days it was overcast. Some days it stormed. Today it was the heavy, low-pressure kind of gray that made everything feel close and airless. He was passing mile marker 17 when something caught his eye. It was a shape on the shoulder of the road, partially buried in snow. At first it looked like nothing, a piece of luggage fallen from a vehicle maybe, the kind of roadside debris that winter collected and forgot. But something about it, the angle, the stillness, the way the snow had drifted around it, rather than over it, as though even the storm was uncertain what to make of it, pulled at his attention in a way he could not dismiss. Caleb eased off the gas. The truck slowed. The wipers cleared the windshield one more time, and in that brief window of clarity, he saw it more clearly. A suitcase, old leather, sitting upright on the frozen shoulder of Highway 42, as though someone had placed it there deliberately carefully and walked away. He pulled the truck to the side of the road. The engine idled. The heater hummed. And Caleb Mercer sat still for a moment, staring through the glass at the shape in the snow, feeling the first faint stirring of something he had not felt in a very long time. The instinct that something was wrong. The instinct that he was supposed to be here. The cold hit him like a wall the moment he opened the truck door. It filled his lungs, instantly sharp and clean, and punishing the kind of cold that made the inside of the nose burn and turned every exhale into a small, vanishing ghost. Snow crunched under his boots with a sound like crumpling paper. Deep, hollow, muffled by the storm that continued to fall around him in long, unbroken sheets of white. The suitcase sat roughly 15 yards from the truck. Caleb approached it slowly, not out of caution, but out of a habit so deeply ingrained it had become reflex. In the field, you never approached anything quickly. You read the ground. You scanned the perimeter. You let your eyes tell you what your mind had not yet processed. The suitcase was old. Brown leather cracked along the edges, the brass clasps tarnished and stiff with frost. Dark patches of moisture had seeped into the surface and frozen there, giving it a mottled appearance like the hide of something long dead. A thin red string hung from the handle, frayed at the end, stiff with ice. The surface bore scratches, dozens of them. Shallow, irregular marks that ran in clusters across the top and sides. Caleb frowned. He crouched, bringing his face closer to the leather. The scratches were not random. They were concentrated near the edges, as though something small had clung to the suitcase with desperate, repeated effort. Small claws. Tiny nails scraping against the surface, trying to hold on to the only solid thing in a world of ice and wind. And then he saw them. Two shapes on top of the suitcase. So small, so still so thoroughly dusted with frost that they had nearly become part of the landscape itself. Two German shepherd puppies, huddled together on the frozen leather, barely breathing. Caleb's chest tightened with a force that surprised him. They were 5 weeks old, maybe 6. Their fur was the soft, uneven fluff of very young pups, black and tan, matted with ice crystals that clung to every strand. Their tiny paws were pressed flat against the suitcase, anchored there by instinct or by fear or by something older than either. Their eyes were closed. Their bodies trembled with a rhythm that was not shivering, but something deeper, something closer to the body's last negotiation with the cold before it surrenders. Caleb lowered himself to one knee in the snow. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way you move near anything that has been hurt badly enough to fear everything. "Hey there," he said softly. His voice was low, steady, instinctively gentle in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him only by reputation. "You don't belong out here." The first puppy opened its eyes, dark liquid enormous in that small face. It stared at Caleb with an expression that held no aggression, no wildness, only a kind of exhausted, trembling hope. The look of something that has been waiting for rescue so long, it has almost forgotten what rescue looks like. The second puppy stirred against its sibling, pressing closer as though trying to share the last warmth left between them. Its nose was crusted with frozen breath. A faint scratch marked its left shoulder, fresh, but not deep. The other had a small patch of missing fur near its neck, the kind of mark left by rough handling rather than nature. Caleb extended his hand palm open, fingers still. He let them smell him. He did not reach. He did not grab. He waited. Because trust even from a creature this small had to be offered, not taken. After a long moment, the first puppy inched forward. Its tiny body shuddered with each breath, but it pressed its cold nose against Caleb's fingers and held it there. The second followed, leaning into its sibling, leaning into the warmth of a human hand, leaning into something it desperately needed to believe in. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. Something he did not have a name for. Something that had been locked in a room he had stopped visiting. He lifted them carefully, one in each arm, tucking them against his chest beneath his open coat. Their small hearts hammered against his ribs, frantic wild, the heartbeats of creatures who had been fighting to survive since before he arrived. He wrapped the coat around them and held them close, and for a few seconds, neither he nor the puppies moved. They simply breathed together in the falling snow. Two tiny lives pressed against the chest of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be needed. He turned toward the truck, but as he moved, both puppies twisted in his arms. Weak, trembling, barely able to hold their heads up, they turned and looked back. Not at the suitcase, not at the road, at the forest. The dark line of trees standing on the far side of Highway 42, silent and deep under the weight of winter. They stared at those trees with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear. Their small bodies tensed, their ears still too soft and floppy to stand upright, tilted forward. One of them let out a sound, not a bark, not a whimper. A thin, aching cry that rose from somewhere deeper than instinct. They were not afraid of the forest. They were afraid for something inside it. Caleb stopped walking. He looked at the puppies. He looked at the trees. And then he looked down at the snow between the suitcase and the tree line. Paw prints, larger than anything these puppies could have made. Wide, deep impressions pressed into the frozen ground, spaced unevenly, one clean the next, angled strangely, the next barely formed, as though the animal that made them had stumbled, had dragged itself, had fought through pain with every step. And beside the prints, faint but unmistakable against the white, a thin streak of red. Blood. Something had been here with these puppies. Something larger. Something that had stayed as long as it could, and then, wounded and bleeding, had dragged itself into the darkness of those trees. Not running from the road. Running from something else. Leading whatever danger existed away from the two small lives it had left behind. A mother. Caleb stood in the falling snow holding two orphaned puppies against his chest, staring into a forest that held a wounded animal he could not see, and a story he did not yet understand. The red string on the suitcase handle trembled in the wind. The scratches on the leather seemed to pulse with meaning he was only beginning to read. Someone had put these puppies here. Someone had placed them on this suitcase in the middle of a frozen highway and walked away. This was not an accident. This was not carelessness. The scratch marks the string, the deliberate placement. This was abandonment executed with precision, and the mother had fought it. She had clawed. She had bled. And when she could no longer stay, she had gone into the forest to die, or to draw danger away from her children, or both. Caleb felt the old familiar coldness rise inside him. Not the cold of winter, the cold of recognition. He knew cruelty. He had seen its face in places most people would never go. He knew what it looked like when power was used against the defenseless. He knew the specific sickening weight of deliberate harm. He carried the puppies to the truck. He set them on the passenger seat, wrapped in his scarf, the heater blowing warm air across their frosted fur. River, the one with the narrow tan stripe between its eyes, began to stir almost immediately, nose twitching, tiny tail moving in the faintest suggestion of life returning. Scout, the darker one with the quiet eyes, simply watched Caleb with a stillness that felt older than its age. Caleb closed the truck door and stood in the storm for one more moment. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the blood in the snow. He looked at the paw prints disappearing into the dark corridor between the pines. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. His mind, for the first time in months, was not circling. It was locked on a single point, a single purpose. There was a mother in those woods, bleeding, freezing, alone. He could not go tonight. The sky was already dimming, the storm intensifying, and the puppies were in no condition to be left alone. But tomorrow, at first light, he would go into that forest. He would follow the blood and the broken tracks and the silence between the trees, and he would not come back without her. He climbed into the truck, the puppies pressed against his leg, trembling, their tiny faces turned toward the window, toward the forest, toward the mother they could still feel somewhere out there in the cold. Caleb put the truck in gear and pulled onto Highway 42. The wipers resumed their rhythm. The snow kept falling, and in the warmth of that aging navy blue pickup, between a man who had lost his purpose and two puppies who had lost their mother, something fragile and unspoken began to take shape. Not hope, not yet. Something before hope. The quiet recognition that perhaps, after everything, the road had brought him to the exact place he was supposed to be. The cabin waited at the end of the lumber road. The fire waited inside. The night waited beyond the windows. And in the forest, growing fainter with every passing hour, a trail of blood waited to be followed by the only man who had stopped to look. The cabin held warmth the way a tired hand holds a candle, carefully, gratefully, as though understanding that letting go meant darkness. Caleb carried the two puppies inside as the last gray threads of daylight dissolved into the early winter night. The wood stove had burned low during his hours on Highway 42, its belly reduced to a shallow bed of embers pulsing with fading orange beneath white ash. He set the puppies on the thick wool blanket near the stove and knelt to rebuild the fire with the quiet efficiency of a man who had coaxed flames to life in far worse places and for far more desperate reasons. The kindling caught. Then the split oak. Heat rose and filled the cabin with a warmth so sudden and so complete that it felt almost like an apology from the world for everything the cold had done that day. Firelight crawled across the log walls across the photograph of his grandfather squinting beside the creek, across two small shapes huddled on the blanket, who had not yet decided whether warmth was something they were allowed to believe in. Caleb poured warm water into a shallow bowl and placed it on the floor within reach. He did not push it toward them. He set it down and waited, because trust, whether from a frightened soldier or a wounded animal or a man's own broken reflection, always begins with patience. The first puppy leaned forward, the one with the narrow tan stripe between its eyes. It sniffed the water with the cautious intensity of a creature for whom every new experience carried the possibility of pain. Then it drank, small hesitant laps that sent tiny ripples across the surface, and as it drank, its tail moved, barely, a tremor more than a wag. But Caleb watched that movement the way a man watches the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth after a fire. He named that one River, for the creek behind the cabin that never stopped moving, not even when the deepest winter tried to silence it. Always running forward, always finding a way. The second puppy did not drink. It watched. It studied the bowl, then the fire, then Caleb, then the door, cycling through each point with a methodical patience that seemed impossible for something 6 weeks old. Only after River finished, only after the room had been evaluated from every angle its small eyes could reach, did the second puppy rise, walk to the bowl, inspect it from 3 angles, and drink. That one he named Scout, for the way it observed before it moved, for the way it placed itself between its brother and the room each time it settled, for the quality of its silence, which was not timidity, but vigilance, a watcher, a guardian in a body that weighed less than 4 pounds. River and Scout. The names arrived fully formed the way the right names always do. They felt earned. Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the couch, his wet coat steaming gently in the heat, and watched the puppies explore their small territory of blanket and firelight. River investigated everything within reach. The edge of the stone hearth, which he touched with his nose, and immediately withdrew from, startled by the heat. The nearest table leg, which he circled twice, as though it might be concealing something worth discovering. The toe of Caleb's boot, which he sniffed with extraordinary thoroughness, and then, having apparently decided it met some internal standard of acceptability, pressed his entire small body against it and sighed. The sigh was enormous, far too large and far too weary for a creature that weighed less than a boot. It was the sigh of something that had been carrying a weight invisible to everyone but itself, and had finally cautiously set it down. Scout followed his brother's movements with tracking eyes, but did not leave the blanket. He lay with his chin resting on his paws, positioned at the edge nearest the door, his ears rotating like small satellites at every sound the cabin produced. The creak of settling timber, the tick of ice forming on glass, the low moan of wind finding gaps in the window frames. Each sound was registered, evaluated, and filed away, and Scout's dark eyes returned to their surveillance only after each one had been judged harmless. Caleb found himself speaking to them, not about anything important. He told River about the well his grandfather dug by hand 50 years ago, because paying the county for plumbing offended his independence. He told Scout that the blanket beneath them had once wrapped a foal born during an ice storm on the Henderson farm, and that foal grew into the most beautiful and meanest horse in Millersfield, a horse that bit every adult who came near it, but stood perfectly gentle for children and dogs. The puppies listened the way animals listen, without judgment, without the compulsion to respond. They received his voice the way the blanket received their weight, and Caleb discovered that speaking to creatures who asked nothing except his presence carried a relief so deep it loosened something behind his ribs he had not realized was clenched. He had not spoken to another living thing in 11 days. He knew because he counted. Not obsessively, but in the way a man registers accumulating silence, the way he registers accumulating snow. It builds, layer upon layer, until the weight becomes something physical. 7 minutes of warmth, 7 minutes of small breathing and crackling fire, and a world that asked nothing of him and threatened nothing, and simply let him sit with 2 small lives and breathe. Then it ended. 11 minutes past midnight. Both puppies lifted their heads at exactly the same instant. The synchronicity was total. One moment they slept in matched crescents, breathing aligned. The next, both heads rose, both ears strained forward, both bodies locked into a rigidity so complete they vibrated with it. Their attention fixed on one point, the cabin door. River barked first, thin, high, fractured with terror. Scout joined instantly. Both erupted in frantic alarm directed not at the forest beyond the door, but at the door itself, at whatever stood on the other side. Caleb was on his feet before the second bark. The shift happened below thought wired by 12 years of breaching rooms and clearing corridors. His hand found the handle. Cold metal. He pulled. The porch was empty. Snow fell into darkness. Wind moved through the pines. The clearing lay undisturbed in every direction except one. Boot prints. Large. Deep. The impression of a man over 200 pounds. They came from the lumber road, crossed the clearing in a straight line, and stopped 4 feet from the cabin door. Right where porch light met darkness. Right where someone standing in the night could see through the window, could see the fire, the blanket, the puppies. The prints stopped, then turned back, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had confirmed what he came to confirm. Caleb crouched and studied them. Work boots, heavy lug soles, size 12 or 13. And in the frozen air, faint but unmistakable, the sharp chemical smell of diesel fuel, the kind that clings to a man who spends his days around heavy trucks and rusting equipment and operations conducted far from anyone who might object. The puppies stood behind him in the doorway. They had stopped barking. The sound they made now was worse, a thin, sustained keening from somewhere below instinct below, thought from the oldest place where fear lives before language exists to name it. They were not shaking from cold. This trembling was different, faster, more violent. The shaking of creatures who recognize danger through the body's ancient memory of who has caused it pain. Scout had pressed behind the door frame until only his dark eyes showed wide and wet. River stood forward, trembling violently, but refusing to retreat his tiny body between the door and his brother. Courage as heartbreaking as it was futile. Whoever had stood on this porch these puppies had met before. The memory lived in their muscles and bones. Caleb stepped inside, closed the door, locked it, checked every window, then sat on the floor and held 2 shaking puppies against his chest until their heartbeats slowed from panic to merely frightened, which was not enough, but was everything he had. Outside, the rumble of a diesel engine receded down the lumber road, growing quieter with each passing second. Not fast, not fleeing, simply withdrawing to a distance where patience could do its work. The sound faded until it became indistinguishable from the wind, and then it was gone. And the night was silent again. And the silence was worse than the sound had been, because the sound at least told you where the danger was. The silence told you only that it was somewhere. Morning came without warmth. The sky shifted from black to old iron. Snow covered the clearing, covered the boot prints, covered everything with a silence that lied about what the darkness had delivered. Caleb had not slept. He sat through the remaining hours with his back against the walleyes on the door. By dawn, his body held the hollow, crystalline alertness of extended wakefulness, a state he knew from deployments, a state he had hoped never to inhabit again. The first knock came at 9:09, light, almost musical. Mr. Mercer, Margaret Hale from the Yellow House. I have biscuits, and frankly, they deserve better than freezing to death on your porch. Caleb opened the door to a woman of 71, standing in 6 inches of fresh snow, as though the weather were a minor inconvenience rather than a hazard. She was small, slender, stooped slightly from decades of bending over kitchen counters and garden beds and bedsides. Her face was soft-lined with the fine cross-hatching of years. Silver hair gathered in a loose bun. Her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She carried a basket covered in patterned cloth. River tumbled past Caleb's legs, immediately tail working in uncertain bursts. Scout appeared, studied Maggie for 30 seconds, and pressed his nose against her knuckle. "Oh," Maggie breathed, lowering herself carefully. "You precious things. You are the voices I have been hearing through the wind." Caleb told her everything. The suitcase on Highway 42. The blood. The paw prints into the forest. The boot prints outside his cabin at midnight. The diesel smell. The way the puppies shook. Maggie listened without interrupting her fingers, moving through River's fur, her expression shifting from warmth to a quiet, controlled fury held behind her eyes like embers behind an iron grate. She opened her mouth to respond when the second knock came. 3 hard strikes. The sound of knuckles that expected doors to open and did not consider alternatives. River stopped wagging instantly. Scout vanished behind the chair. Both puppies fell silent in a way that was far worse than any bark. Caleb opened the door. Dean Garrett stood on the porch like a weather system that had taken human form. Tall, broad, with a heavy, soft bulk that came from mass rather than discipline. A dark green hunting jacket stained with mud and engine grease. Wool cap pulled low. Boots crusted with snow that was not from this morning. His face was angular cheekbones sharp beneath weathered skin jaw covered in rough stubble. He might have been 45 or 60. Hard living aged a man the way drought aged wood, unevenly and without mercy. His eyes were pale gray, restless. They moved past Caleb into the cabin with the quick cataloging efficiency of someone not looking at a room, but inventorying what it contained and what could be removed. Morning, gravel voice, cigarettes and sleeplessness. Name is Dean Garrett. A smile appeared that did not belong on his face, sitting on his features like something borrowed and poorly fitted. Lost a few of my dogs. Good hunting dogs. German shepherds. Figured they wandered this direction. Behind Caleb a sound, not a bark, something far more primitive. The high involuntary vocalization of a creature encountering a specific human whose presence means pain. The sound of an animal whose body remembers what its young mind cannot yet name. Caleb felt the puppies press against his boots with force that traveled through leather into bone. Scout disappeared behind his ankle. River positioned himself between the door and his brother, shaking so violently his claws tapped the floor in rapid staccato. But he did not retreat, even now. even terrified. Dean's gray eyes flicked past Caleb's shoulder. Quick, focused, predatory. Sounds like something moving around in there. Caleb filled the doorway completely. You will not be seeing anything in this cabin. The borrowed smile dropped. Dean's jaw shifted. Those dogs represent an investment. I have every right to reclaim my property. You want me to call the sheriff. Please, Caleb said evenly. Call him. Dean's left eye twitched once, barely perceptible, but Caleb had spent 12 years reading micro-expressions in environments where failing to read a face meant dying. That twitch was a tell. Dean Garrett wanted law enforcement near this situation the way a fire wants water. Dean Garrett. The voice came from behind Dean from the porch steps, carrying the calm of a woman who had outlived her fear of men who confused intimidation with authority. Maggie had moved outside without either man noticing, slipping through the doorway with the quiet competence of someone who had spent decades navigating rooms dominated by louder people. I was hoping the rumors about your leaving this county were true. It appears hope is not what it used to be. Dean turned. His aggression pulled inward, becoming something warier. Mrs. Hale. Still running with those men who trapped and bred and sold dogs off the books from that property on Route 9. Maggie climbed the last step. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Sheriff Braddock warned every household in this county about you 6 years ago. The Hendersons lost their beagle. Ruth Calloway lost 2 hounds that had been in her family a full decade. You remember that, Mr. Garrett? Or is the memory of the damage you caused something you have trained yourself to discard? Dean attempted a scoff. Old accusations. Nothing proven. Absence of proof is not absence of truth. It means someone was careful. And careful men, in my experience, make their worst mistakes precisely when they believe they are still being careful. Caleb watched the calculation resolve behind Dean's eyes. A witness with specific memory and no evident fear. Names, dates, families. The math did not favor pressing forward. You should leave, Caleb said. Dean stared 3 seconds, then stepped back off the porch with the deliberate rhythm of a man who wanted it understood. This was choice, not retreat. He looked at the cabin, the tree line, Caleb. Things that belong to me, he said, and his voice dropped below everything before it and became something infinitely more dangerous. I always get back. He walked into the gray morning and was consumed by it. Caleb closed the door. The puppies were crying, not barking. The thin, sustained keening of creatures reliving a terror they could not escape. He knelt and gathered them against his chest. River buried his face in Caleb's sleeve. Scout pressed his entire body beneath Caleb's arm and shook. These dogs did not fear strangers. They feared this man, this voice, this smell of diesel and cruelty. Dean Garrett was the thing their mother had bled to take them from, the thing that stood outside cabin doors in the dark. Maggie held her shawl tight, her pale eyes burning. You need to find that mother before he does. Caleb nodded. Beneath his ribs, in the place where mission purpose used to live, something stirred. Something that had been silent for a very long time. The forest received him the way forests receive all men, without welcome, without refusal, with the vast, indifferent patience of something that has watched people come and go for centuries and knows none of them stay. Caleb entered the tree line that afternoon, following the faded paw prints from the day before. Snow fell in a thin, intermittent veil that softened the landscape without erasing it. The pines stood silent, branches bowed under burdens of ice that caught weak light and scattered it in cold fragments across the forest floor. He moved the way training had taught him, steady, measured, each step intentional. Eyes working in systematic sweeps, reading the snow the way a cartographer reads terrain, the way a man who has survived by noticing what others overlook reads every surface as a sentence in a story that the landscape is always telling. A broken branch at knee height where something large had pushed through. A depression in the powder where a body had collapsed and rested before forcing itself upward again. Disturbed ice crystals along a fallen log suggesting movement. Heading north, along the creek, toward the ridge. 20 minutes in, he found blood. A thin streak of red against ice near a spruce tree. He crouched, cleared the surrounding snow, and studied it. Fresh enough that cold had not fully crystallized it. A few feet further, another drop. Then another. Spaced irregularly. The trail of an animal for whom each step was a negotiation between will and the body's insistence that will was no longer sufficient. He followed the blood north along the frozen creek. Forest thickened. Light dimmed. Trunks rose like pillars of something ancient canopy so dense that snow barely reached the ground, leaving patches of bare earth and frozen moss that felt untouched by human presence. Then the trap, steel jaw, near the creek's edge, half buried in drift and fallen branches. The jaws had been forced open with raw, desperate strength, bent at angles metal was not designed to accommodate. Blood stained the teeth. Ground surrounding it, torn in deep gouges carved by claws, fighting through agony with the kind of determination a 6-pound steel mechanism was never built to withstand from a 60-pound dog. Caleb touched the cold metal. His jaw locked. This was not random placement. The positioning was surgical, set at a natural bottleneck where the creek narrowed and the banks compressed any animal following the water into a corridor barely 4 feet wide. Infrastructure. Someone who had studied this forest's patterns and laid steel in the exact places where living things had no choice but to walk. He followed drag marks deeper along the creek, but light was dying. Clouds had sealed the sky into solid iron. Temperature dropping with the authority of something that intended no negotiation. Each breath burned colder than the last. He did not find her. He turned back. The decision came from discipline, from the hard understanding that dying in the woods served nothing. The puppies were alone in the cabin. Dean Garrett waited somewhere with knowledge and intent. Caleb was one man without light, losing heat faster than movement could replace it. He returned as darkness claimed the final edge of the sky. The puppies struck the door before he opened it fully. Claws clicking frantically, cries rising in desperate waves. They pushed against his legs, sniffed his coat, found on the fabric traces of pine and iron and something that smelled like their mother's blood. Caleb knelt and held them. Their hearts pounded against his palms with the stuttering rhythm of creatures who had spent hours watching a door waiting for the one person who promised to bring back the thing they needed most. He had not brought her. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "I promise. Tomorrow." Night filled the cabin. Fire burned low. Puppies curled against his legs, breathing shallow and irregular, too exhausted to stay awake, too frightened to truly sleep. Caleb sat against the couch and let the memories come. They arrived without permission. They always did. Certain combinations of darkness and cold and the sound of something small and suffering opened a door in his mind that no lock had ever held. A village, not Vermont. somewhere that smelled of dust and diesel and overripe fruit and air heated past the point where breathing felt natural. A narrow alley between mud brick walls, the weight of tactical gear, a voice in his earpiece guiding the team through a compound flagged 6 hours earlier. Then the sound, low, grinding, a load-bearing wall surrendering to gravity. Dust erupted in a column that turned afternoon to midnight. And through the dust, through the shouting, through secondary fractures cracking through the structure overhead, one sound that cut through everything. A child crying. Caleb dug. He remembered with merciless precision, bare hands in rubble pulling broken concrete that sliced through gloves into skin. Teammates screaming fall back. The building groaning overhead like a wounded animal deciding whether to finish what it started. He did not stop. The crying continued. As long as it continued, the child was alive. As long as the child was alive, retreat was not something his body would permit. He reached her. A girl, 4 years old, maybe less. Eyes enormous in a dust-coated face. She looked at him with not fear, but focused, desperate will. The expression of a living thing pouring every ounce into staying alive. Their eyes met. 1/2 second of connection so complete, it needed no language and no translation. Then the second wall came down. Wait. Darkness. Silence. When they pulled him free, every sound arrived through deep water. He turned his head toward the place where the girl had been. The crying had stopped. He carried that silence for 3 years, through discharge paperwork, into a VA hospital room in Burlington where a therapist named Dr. Ellison asked each week what he heard when everything went quiet. "I hear silence," Caleb told him, "and it sounds exactly like the moment I was not enough." River whimpered in sleep. A tiny puppy sound, but it reached into the dark behind Caleb's closed eyes like a hand extended through black water, and he followed it upward toward the surface, toward the cabin, toward the fire, toward now. He opened his eyes. His hands were shaking. He watched the tremor without trying to stop it, because stopping it had never worked, and pretending it was absent only drove it deeper into his body, where it lived like a second pulse. River had placed one small paw on Caleb's wrist in sleep. The weight of that paw was almost nothing. The warmth was barely perceptible, but the contact was real and present and belonged to this moment and not to any other moment, and it acted on the tremor in his hands the way a hand placed on a vibrating string acts on its sound. It did not silence it completely, but it changed the frequency. It slowed the shaking from a storm to a tremor, to something a man could hold a cup through if he concentrated. Something a man could survive until morning. Scout had not moved from his position near the door, but his eyes were open and watching Caleb in the firelight with an expression that held no confusion. Only a steady, patient attention that seemed to say he understood in whatever way a 6-week-old animal understands that the man on the floor was fighting something that could not be seen, and that the best way to help was simply to be present and to not look away. A soft knock at the door. Familiar. Maggie entered carrying a thermos and a small lantern, and the unshakable conviction that no one should sit alone at 2 a.m. with only ghosts for company. She sat on the couch without invitation, poured chamomile tea into the thermos cap, placed it in his hands without asking what was wrong, because the geography of grief was a landscape she had walked for years, and she recognized the terrain without needing a map. "My boy did not die because he was weak," she said, after a long silence in which neither of them spoke and neither needed to. He died because he would not stop. Because quitting was not something his heart understood how to do, even when quitting would have been the thing that saved him. She looked at Caleb. Her pale blue eyes held no pity, only recognition. The luminous, steady understanding of a woman who had lost everything that mattered and had learned through years of practice to carry that loss without being consumed by it. He was the kind of man who ran into buildings already burning for people he had never met, the kind who dug through wreckage with bare hands. She paused. I see that same refusal in you, Caleb. It terrifies me. But it also makes me believe that if anyone in this county can bring that mother home, it is the man sitting on this floor who does not know how to give up. Caleb held the tea, felt its warmth move through his palms, felt the puppies breathing against his legs and the fire at his back and the weight of her words settling into the hollow spaces inside his chest where purpose had once lived before the silence in the rubble took it away. I will not fail them, he said quietly, and he meant the puppies and the mother somewhere in the frozen dark. And though he could not say it aloud, and perhaps did not fully know it yet, he meant himself. Maggie stood, gathered her shawl, walked to the door, and paused with one hand on the frame. Some things do not get lost, Caleb. They wait for the right person to come find them. She stepped into the night. Her lantern swayed as she moved through the falling snow, a small point of golden light growing smaller and fainter against the vast white darkness until the distance took her and the lantern became a memory and the cabin was quiet again. But the quiet was different now. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a man alone with his failures. It was the quiet of a room where something important has just been said and the walls are still holding the echo. Caleb looked at the puppies, both awake now, both watching him with dark, steady eyes that held one message and needed no translation. Find her. I will bring her home, he whispered. I swear it. The fire settled into embers. Wind pressed against the cabin walls with the patient insistence of something that would outlast every structure built to resist it. And inside, sitting on a cold floor with two small lives pressed against his legs, a man who had believed for 3 years that he had nothing left to give, felt something rising through him, like warmth returning to frozen ground. Not the purpose of a soldier, not orders from someone else's war. Something older. Something earned by two small creatures who asked nothing except that he not give up. Tomorrow, he would go deeper into the forest. Tomorrow, he would follow the blood and the broken trail into whatever waited. Tomorrow, he would not return without her. The next morning arrived without true sunlight, only a muted gray haze that hung over the Vermont hills like an unfinished sentence. Snow drifted in slow, patient spirals, soft enough to quiet the world, but persistent enough to erase whatever the night had tried to preserve. Caleb Mercer stepped out of his cabin into the brittle stillness at first light. His breath curled from his lips in pale, vanishing clouds. The forest before him waited in silence. A wide, frozen cathedral of pine pressing into itself branches bowed from the weight of winter shadows pooling between the trunks like dark water that had forgotten how to move. He adjusted the strap of his pack. Inside it, he had placed a thermal blanket, a first aid kit assembled from what the cabin could provide, water a length of rope, and the heavy flashlight his grandfather had kept mounted near the door for 30 years. He did not know what condition the mother would be in when he found her. He only knew that today failure was not a possibility he was willing to carry home. He glanced back at the cabin window. Two small faces appeared behind the frosted glass. River and Scout watching him with an intensity that pressed against the pane like hands against a wall. Their ears were low. Their bodies trembled. But their eyes held the same message they had held since the moment he lifted them from that frozen suitcase on Highway 42. Find her. He gave them a single nod and stepped off the porch. The snow swallowed the sound of his boots as he crossed into the tree line. Overnight accumulation had softened the landscape further, blurring the tracks he had followed the day before. But the direction held in his memory, imprinted there by the same instinct that had once guided him through hostile terrain in the dark without maps or markers. The creek bed, the ridge, the blood trail heading north. He moved carefully through the pines, his breathing controlled his senses, calibrated to the particular frequency of a winter forest at dawn. Silence, but not true silence. The creak of branches under their burden of ice. The faint percussion of frozen crystals falling from high limbs and shattering against the forest floor. The distant, almost subliminal groan of the wind turning against the ridge. Each sound registered and was catalogued, and was dismissed as he pressed deeper. 20 minutes in, he found the place where he had turned back the day before. The spruce tree with the blood streak, the frozen creek bed where the drag marks had led him to the steel trap. He paused here and knelt, reading the ground again with fresh eyes. The trap was as he had left it, jaws bent wide, blood on the teeth. But something else caught his attention now that he had not noticed in yesterday's fading light. Partially buried in the drift beside the trap, nearly invisible against the frozen earth, lay a second trap. Closed, unsprung. Positioned 3 feet from the first, angled to catch anything that escaped the primary device. Caleb brushed the snow away carefully and stared at it. A backup trap, placed deliberately to ensure that an animal which freed itself from the first would stumble immediately into the second. The level of calculation required for this arrangement was not the work of a careless man. It was the work of someone who understood animal behavior, who anticipated resistance, who designed systems to eliminate every possibility of escape. He stood and scanned the surrounding area with new intent. Within 10 minutes, he found a third trap set along the creek bank 40 yards upstream. A fourth was concealed beneath a layer of pine needles near a game trail intersection. Each one positioned with surgical precision at a natural choke point, a place where the terrain funneled movement into a narrow corridor from which there was no alternative route. This was not poaching. This was not a man with a grudge against wildlife. This was an operation, organized, maintained, and designed to capture animals systematically over a wide area of forest. Near the fourth trap, half buried in frozen mud, Caleb found something that stopped his breathing for a full 3 seconds. A collar. Leather cracked with age and weather fitted with a small metal tag. He brushed the dirt away and read the stamped numbers on the tag. No name, no address. Just a sequence. 037. He turned the collar over. The leather was worn thin in places rubbed raw by repeated use. The buckle showed teeth marks where an animal had tried to chew through it, and the inside surface carried dark stains that could have been dirt, but were not dirt. Caleb placed the collar in his pack and kept moving. The blood trail from the mother was fainter now, nearly erased by overnight snowfall, but still readable to a man who had spent years tracking movement through terrain designed to conceal it. He followed the traces north along the creek, past the ridge of jagged rocks, where the wind cut sideways through the trees into a section of forest so dense that the canopy blocked nearly all light and the ground beneath was a mosaic of bare earth, frozen moss, and the skeletal remains of fallen trees that had lain undisturbed for decades. The trail led uphill, each step steeper than the last. The drag marks grew wider as the incline increased, suggesting an animal that was using more and more of its body to pull itself forward. Smears of blood appeared on rocks where the dog had rested against the stone, pressing its wound against the cold surface in what might have been an instinctive attempt to slow the bleeding, or might have simply been the final exhaustion of a body that could no longer choose where it stopped. Meanwhile, at the cabin, Maggie Hale sat in the wooden chair by the window, with River sleeping in her lap, and Scout positioned at her feet, his small head resting on her shoe, but his eyes fixed on the door. She had come at dawn, unbidden, carrying a thermos and a quiet certainty that her presence was needed here today. She did not know what Caleb would find in the forest. She only knew that whatever he found these puppies should not be alone when he returned with it. Through the frosted glass, she watched the tree line, the dark corridor of pines where Caleb had disappeared an hour ago, and beyond the trees moving slowly along the lumber road with the unhurried patience of someone conducting surveillance rather than traveling a green truck she recognized. Dean Garrett. He did not stop. He drove past the cabin at a speed that was deliberately slow, his truck visible through the gaps in the trees for nearly a full minute before the road curved and took him from view. He was not approaching. He was not confronting. He was watching, measuring, confirming that Caleb had left the property. Maggie's thin hands tightened around the thermos. River stirred in her lap, sensing the change in her body. Scout's ears rotated toward the window. She knew what Dean was doing. She had watched men like him her entire life. Men who did not attack until they were certain of advantage. Men who gathered information the way a predator gathers distance before a charge. He was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment, she understood with a cold clarity, would come the instant the cabin was unprotected. She was not going to let that happen. The forest deepened around Caleb. The ridge rose, and somewhere ahead, growing closer with every painful step, was an answer he was not yet ready to receive. Caleb saw her from 30 yards away, a dark shape against the white base of the rock face, motionless except for a faint tremor that rippled through her fur like wind across still water. He slowed his approach, controlled his breathing, lowered his center of gravity the way he would when approaching any wounded creature, human or animal, whose fear might be greater than its injury. The mother German shepherd lay curled at the base of a shallow overhang where the rock formation created a natural shelter from the wind. Her body was half buried in drifted snow, her thick coat matted with ice and dirt, and the particular dullness that comes from days without food or adequate water. One of her hind legs was twisted at an angle that no healthy limb should hold, swollen to nearly twice its natural size around deep puncture wounds that wept a slow, dark fluid into the snow beneath her. Her breathing was shallow, each exhale a faint, ragged whisper that barely fogged the air. Her ribs were visible beneath her coat, rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of a body operating on the last reserves of something that was not quite energy and not quite will, but some fusion of both that exists only in creatures fighting to stay alive for reasons beyond their own survival. Caleb knelt in the snow 10 feet from her. He did not reach. He let her register his presence through scent, through sound, through whatever senses she still had functioning. "Easy girl," he said softly. "Easy." Her eyes opened. Amber. clouded with exhaustion but still holding a light that should not have been possible given the condition of her body. The light of a mother whose children were somewhere in the world without her. The light that burns when everything else has been spent. She looked at Caleb, not with fear, not with the defensive aggression of a cornered animal. She looked at him with an expression that he recognized because he had seen it once before in a narrow alley in a village far from here, on the face of a 4-year-old girl trapped beneath a collapsed wall. The expression of a living thing that has been holding on with everything it has and is deciding in this single moment whether the person in front of it is worth trusting with whatever time remains. "You did well," Caleb whispered. "You made it farther than anyone would have expected. Your babies are safe. They are warm. They are waiting for you." He moved forward slowly, reached out his hand. She did not pull away. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release days of accumulated fear, and she leaned into his touch. Her nose lifted weakly, searching the air around his coat, and he knew what she was looking for. The scent of her puppies. It was there embedded in the fabric from nights of holding them close. She found it, and a sound escaped her that was not a whine and not a cry, but something between the two, something that contained within it all the anguish and relief and desperate love of a mother who has done the impossible and lived long enough to learn that it was not for nothing. Caleb removed his coat. He wrapped it around her body, carefully securing the thermal blanket from his pack beneath it, creating a cocoon of warmth around her torso and injured leg. When he lifted her, her weight surprised him. Not because she was heavy, but because she was far too light for a dog her size. The weight of an animal that had been starved and frozen and run to the edge of death and had kept going anyway. He held her against his chest. She did not resist. She leaned into him, completely surrendering the last of her vigilance to a stranger whose hands were steady and whose heartbeat was close and whose coat smelled like her children. For a man who had once carried wounded teammates across hostile ground under fire, the sensation struck him with unexpected force. This was not the weight of duty. This was not the weight of orders. This was the weight of a life choosing to trust him with everything it had left. Silent, absolute, given without conditions. He began the descent. The forest was darker now, the clouds thickening overhead, the wind picking up from the north with the sharpened edge that preceded serious storms. Snow began to fall in heavier curtains. Caleb adjusted his grip on the dog and moved steadily downhill, picking his path through the trees with the mechanical precision of a man who cannot afford to stumble because what he carries is too important to drop. Halfway down the ridge, she stirred, her nose pressed against his neck. A faint sound escaped her, and Caleb knew with the same certainty that had guided him through every critical moment of his life that she was thanking him, not in words, in the only language she had. He held her tighter. "Almost there," he said. "Almost home." The cabin appeared through the trees 40 minutes later. Caleb's arms burned. His legs shook with fatigue. Snow clung to his hair and his beard, and the exposed skin of his hands where the cold had turned his fingers stiff and clumsy. But he had not stopped. Not once. Maggie opened the door before he reached the porch. Her pale eyes took in the shape in his arms, and her hand went to her mouth, and she stepped aside without a word. The moment he crossed the threshold, the sound that erupted from the cabin floor was unlike anything Caleb had ever heard. River and Scout exploded from behind the chair with a force that seemed impossible for their size. Their cries rose instantly high and trembling and fractured with a quality of emotion that transcended anything animal or human categories could neatly contain. They scrambled across the wood floor claws, sliding small bodies colliding with each other in their desperation to reach her. Caleb lowered the mother onto the blanket beside the fire. The puppies were on her before she was fully settled. They pressed their faces into her fur with a force that their small bodies should not have been able to produce. They pushed against her sides, climbing over each other, their paws sliding on the blanket as they fought to get closer, to get as close as physics and skin and bone would allow. They cried with a sound that was not pain and not joy, but the specific, devastating frequency of reunion after the kind of separation that creatures this young should never have to endure. It was a sound that filled the cabin and pressed against the walls and made the fire seem to burn brighter, as though even the flames understood that something important was happening in this room. River found the hollow beneath his mother's chin and pressed himself there, his entire body shaking with sobs that had no sound. Scout pushed his face into the fur of her shoulder and held it there without moving, as though he had finally found the one fixed point in the universe that he had been searching for since the moment he was placed on a frozen suitcase and left behind. And then slowly, with the last strength she possessed, the mother opened her eyes. She saw her puppies first, both of them, alive, warm, here. Her muzzle lowered and touched River's head, then Scout's. A gesture so gentle and so deliberate that it seemed to cost her everything she had left, and to be worth every fraction of that cost. Then she looked at Caleb, amber eyes meeting steel blue, and in that look was everything that needed to be said, and nothing that words could have improved upon. Caleb rested his hand on her neck. Her pulse beat weakly against his palm. Alive. Here. Home. Then he saw what he had not been able to see in the darkness and the snow and the desperate urgency of the overhang. Around her neck, beneath the matted fur, hidden by the ice and the grime of days spent fighting to survive in a frozen wilderness, was a band of leather so tight it had worn the fur away entirely and left the skin beneath red and raw. He parted the coat carefully and found it. A collar. Not a pet collar. A numbered collar. The leather strip carried a metal tag identical in design to the one he had found near the fourth trap. Stamped numbers 041. The collar had been cut, not removed with a buckle, but sliced with a blade, and then retied with a crude knot of wire, as though someone had replaced it hurriedly after it had been taken off for some purpose and then put back on before the animal was returned to wherever she had been held. Caleb's fingers moved through the fur along her sides. Beneath the coat, he found what the cold and the dirt and the distance had hidden from him until now. Her body told a story that her eyes had been too exhausted to communicate. Along her abdomen, the skin was stretched and loose in the particular way that comes not from a single litter, but from many. Multiple pregnancies carried in rapid succession, the kind of cycle that no natural breeding pattern would produce. The kind that only happened when an animal was being used. She had not been abandoned. She had been inventory. The suitcase on Highway 42 was not a random act of cruelty. It was disposal. When this dog could no longer produce litters at the rate required when her body began to fail under the demands placed on it, she had been loaded into a vehicle with her final litter driven to a frozen highway and discarded. The suitcase was not a gesture of mercy. It was a receipt stamped closed, a file marked complete, a living thing reclassified as waste. Caleb sat back on his heels. The fire crackled. The puppies cried softly against their mother's fur. Maggie stood by the window with one hand pressed to her lips and the other gripping the back of the chair as though the floor beneath her had shifted. "This is not one man with a few traps," Caleb said quietly. His voice carried the flat, controlled cadence of someone processing information that changes everything. "This is a system, numbered collars, breeding cycles, disposal protocol. Dean Garrett is running an operation." Maggie's pale eyes glistened. "How many?" Caleb looked at the collar in his hand. Number 41. He thought of the collar he had found near the trap. Number 37. He thought of the bones near the creek. The system of steel jaws laid through the forest like a web. "More than we want to know," he said. The fire popped. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow began to fall harder, the flakes thickening from a veil into a wall. And through that wall, if Caleb had been standing on the porch, instead of kneeling beside a dog who had survived something that should have killed her, he would have seen what Maggie had seen an hour earlier. Fresh tire tracks in the snow, leading toward the cabin, then away, then back again. The deliberate circling pattern of a man who was no longer simply watching. Dean Garrett knew the mother had been found, and whatever he planned to do about it, the storm that was building over the hills of Millersfield would give him all the cover he needed. Caleb looked at Willow, at her puppies pressed against her sides, at the numbered collar in his hand that connected this wounded family to a network of suffering that extended far beyond one forest, one road, one suitcase in the snow. He had entered that forest this morning to save a dog. He was sitting in this cabin now, understanding that what he had found was something much larger, much darker, and much more dangerous than a single injured animal lost in the winter. And the man responsible for all of it was circling closer with each pass of his truck through the falling snow, patient and deliberate, waiting for the storm to give him what patience alone could not. The storm arrived the way the worst things in life arrive, not with warning, but with a certainty that made you realize the warnings had been there all along, and you had chosen not to hear them. By late afternoon, the sky over Millersfield had sealed itself into a single unbroken ceiling of iron gray, so low it seemed to press against the treetops. The wind, which had been shifting and testing all morning, committed itself fully to the north, and came howling down through the hills, with a force that made the cabin walls groan and the windows rattle in their frames, like teeth chattering. Snow did not fall. It drove. Horizontal sheets of white that erased the tree line and reduced the world to a circle of visibility no wider than 20 feet in any direction. Inside the cabin, the fire burned high. Caleb had fed it until the stove's iron belly glowed a dull, angry orange. The heat pushed back against the cold, seeping through every crack and gap in the old timber walls, and for now, the heat was winning, but the margin was narrow, and the storm was patient. Willow lay on the thick blanket beside the stove. Her breathing had steadied since the morning, each inhale slightly deeper than the one before, each exhale slightly less labored. The thermal blanket from Caleb's pack was still wrapped around her torso, and the makeshift bandage he had fashioned from torn cloth held firmly around her injured leg. She was not well. She was far from well, but she was no longer dying in the specific, urgent way she had been dying when he carried her out of the forest, and for now, that distinction was enough. River and Scout had not left her side since the reunion. They lay pressed against her belly in the configuration of creatures who had found the thing they needed most in the world, and intended never to be separated from it again. River's small head rested on his mother's front paw, rising and falling with her breathing. Scout was tucked into the curve of her body, his dark eyes open his ears, rotating at every sound the storm produced, maintaining the vigil he had appointed himself to, even as exhaustion pulled at every part of him. Caleb sat at the table with the numbered collar in front of him. Tag 41. He turned it over slowly, studying the crude wire knot, the worn leather, the dark stains. Beside it lay the collar from the forest. Tag 37. 2 numbers from a sequence that implied dozens more. He thought about the bones he had seen near the creek. The system of traps laid with surgical precision across the forest floor. The backup trap positioned 3 feet from the primary. The disposal protocol that ended with a suitcase on a frozen highway. Each detail slotted into place with the mechanical precision of evidence assembling itself into a picture that Caleb did not want to see but could no longer look away from. This was not a man who mistreated a few dogs. This was a man who had built infrastructure, supply chains, procedures for acquisition, breeding, and disposal. The numbered collars were inventory tags. The traps were collection devices. The forest was a facility, and the suitcase on Highway 42 was nothing more than the final station in a process that treated living creatures as units of production to be used until they broke and then discarded. A knock at the door. Soft. Familiar. Maggie entered in a gust of wind and snow that swirled across the cabin floor before Caleb could close the door behind her. She was bundled in her heavy brown coat, the fur-lined hood framing her face. Her silver hair plastered against her forehead by the wet. She carried a canvas bag in one hand and her lantern in the other. And despite the storm and the cold, and the fact that the walk from her house on the hill to this cabin was nearly a mile through, accumulating snow, her expression held no complaint. Only a determination that Caleb had come to recognize as the defining feature of her character. The quiet, immovable resolve of a woman who had decided that something needed doing and was not interested in discussing whether it was convenient. "I am not going home tonight," she said, setting the bag on the table. It contained bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a jar of soup that was still warm. "Do not ask me to." "I was not going to," Caleb said. Maggie removed her coat and hung it by the door. She knelt beside Willow, her thin hands settling gently on the dog's neck. Willow opened her eyes at the touch. Amber meeting pale blue. Then she exhaled and closed her eyes again, accepting the touch the way she had accepted Caleb's, with the quiet surrender of a creature that has learned in a single day that not every human hand means pain. "The night my son died," Maggie said quietly, her fingers moving through the fur behind Willow's ear. "I stood at my kitchen window and watched the fire trucks go past. I knew where they were going. I knew what it meant. And I stood there, just stood there, watching the lights disappear down the road as though my feet had been nailed to the floor." She paused. The fire crackled. The wind screamed against the north wall. "I have spent 10 years asking myself what I would have done differently if I could go back to that window. And the answer is always the same. I would have moved. I would have walked out that door and followed those lights and been there. It would not have changed what happened, but it would have changed what happened to me." She looked at Caleb. "That is why I am here tonight. Not because I think I can fight. Not because I think an old woman with stiff knees is going to make a difference if something goes wrong. but because standing at a window while someone else faces the hard thing alone is something I am no longer willing to do. Caleb held her gaze. He did not argue. He understood in the way that people who have lost things understand each other without requiring the full vocabulary of grief, that her presence here was not about him. It was about her, about the version of herself she had decided to become in the years since her son's death. The version that moved toward the fire instead of watching it from a safe distance. He looked at Willow, at River and Scout pressed against her, at Maggie kneeling beside them, at the collars on the table, at the fire holding its ground against the storm. This was the closest thing to a family he had possessed since before the wall collapsed in a village whose name he could not say. A wounded dog, 2 orphaned puppies, a 71-year-old woman who had walked through a blizzard because she refused to stand at another window, and himself, a man held together by training and habit and the small, persistent warmth of creatures who needed him to remain intact. The realization did not arrive with the force of revelation. It arrived with the quiet weight of truth that has been present for some time and simply waited for the moment when the person carrying it was ready to set it down and look at it clearly. If Dean Garrett took Willow back, the evidence on her body disappeared. The numbered collar, the signs of forced breeding, the connection between her and the system of traps in the forest. She was the proof. And Dean knew it, which meant Dean was not coming back for property. He was coming back to eliminate a witness. He will come tonight, Caleb said. Maggie nodded. She had already known. The storm built. The windows shook. And in the yellow light of the cabin, 4 humans and animals who had found each other through accident and instinct, and the particular gravity that draws wounded things together, waited for the darkness to deliver what it had been promising since the first boot print appeared in the snow outside the door. The engine sound came at 11 minutes past 9, muffled by the storm but unmistakable beneath the wind. Not 1 engine, 2. Approaching from the lumber road with the slow, deliberate crawl of vehicles whose drivers were in no hurry because they believed the storm had given them all the cover they would need. Caleb was at the window before the headlights appeared, 2 sets of beams pushing through the wall of snow like pale, searching eyes. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, both engines cut off simultaneously. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Caleb moved through the cabin with the controlled efficiency of a man whose body remembered protocols his conscious mind had tried to forget. He checked the back door, locked, the windows, secured. He positioned the table against the far wall to create more open floor space. He placed the flashlight within reach of the front door. Then he turned to Maggie. "Stay with them," he said, indicating Willow and the puppies. "Do not open the door. Do not go near the windows." Maggie's face was pale, but her jaw was set. She moved to the blanket and sat beside Willow, placing herself between the dog and the door. River and Scout pressed closer to their mother, their small bodies trembling. Willow's eyes were open, alert. Her injured leg was useless, but her head was raised and her ears were forward, and a low, sustained growl had begun in her chest, a sound that came from a place deeper than pain, deeper than exhaustion, from the ancient and unbreakable place where a mother's refusal to let her children be taken again lived like a fire that no storm could extinguish. The first blow hit the door at 9:17. Not a knock, an impact. The entire frame shuddered. The latch groaned. Snow fell from the eaves outside in a cascade of white. A second impact. Harder. The wood cracked along the lower hinge. Cold air pushed through the fracture in a thin, whistling stream. Caleb positioned himself 3 feet from the door, weight-balanced hands open, breathing controlled. The training was there. 12 years of it coiled in his muscles like a spring that had never fully released. He did not want this. He had not wanted it since the day he left the service. But the body does not ask permission. It simply responds to the signal it was built to recognize. The door broke inward on the 3rd strike. Dean Garrett came through the opening with the momentum of a man who had expected resistance and planned to overwhelm it with mass. Behind him, a second figure filled the doorway. Shorter but wide, wearing a dark jacket and a knit cap pulled to the eyebrows, face obscured by the storm and the shadows. Caleb met Dean before he had fully cleared the threshold. He drove his shoulder into Dean's chest, redirecting the larger man's forward momentum sideways, sending him stumbling into the wall. The cabin shook with the impact. A shelf collapsed. Books and a kerosene lamp crashed to the floor. Dean recovered faster than his size suggested he should. He swung a wide, heavy fist that caught the edge of Caleb's jaw and sent a bright flash of white across his vision. Caleb absorbed the blow the way he had been trained to absorb blows, not by resisting, but by moving with the force, converting the impact into rotation, using the turn to create distance and reassess. The second man came at him from the right. Caleb caught the movement in his peripheral vision and sidestepped, grabbing the man's jacket and using his own momentum to drive him into the table. The table slid across the floor and struck the wall. The man grunted, stumbled, and went down. Dean charged again. Caleb caught his wrist twisted and forced him off balance. Dean's boots slipped on the wooden floor, slick with melted snow. He staggered sideways. Caleb pressed the advantage, driving Dean backward toward the broken door. Then Dean's associate regained his footing. The man came from behind. His arm locked around Caleb's throat. Not a trained chokehold, but effective through sheer leverage and weight. Caleb felt his airway compress. His vision narrowed. Dean straightened and stepped forward, his pale gray eyes bright with adrenaline and rage. "Should have let it go," Dean hissed. "Should have minded your own business." His fist connected with Caleb's ribs. Once. Twice. The pain was sharp and immediate, but secondary to the compression on his throat. Caleb drove his elbow backward into the man holding him. The grip loosened. He drove it again harder and felt the arm release. He spun, grabbed the associate by the collar, slammed him into the door frame. The man's eyes went unfocused. He slid down the wall and did not get up. Dean used the distraction. He lunged past Caleb toward the interior of the cabin, toward the blanket, toward Willow. Willow saw him coming. Despite the shattered leg, despite the days of starvation and cold, despite every reason her body had to surrender, she rose. Not fully, not gracefully. She pulled herself upright on 3 legs, placed her body between Dean and her puppies, and bared her teeth with a snarl that came from somewhere beyond the physical capacity of a dog in her condition. It was the sound of a mother who had already dragged herself through a steel trap and across miles of frozen forest to protect her children, and who was communicating in the only language she had that she would do it again and again and again until there was nothing left of her to do it with. Dean hesitated. 1 second. Just long enough. Caleb hit him from the side. They crashed into the floor together, rolling across the boards, knocking the kerosene lamp's remains aside in a scatter of glass. Caleb locked Dean's arm behind his back and drove his face into the wood. Dean bucked. twisted. His free hand clawed at the floor. "You do not know what you are messing with," he spat through gritted teeth. "I have buyers in 3 counties, dogs breeding stock fighting rings. You think this ends with me?" The words came out in fragments between the exertion and the fury, but Caleb heard every one of them. Fighting rings, buyers, 3 counties. The scope of the operation laid bare in the desperate ravings of a man who felt his control slipping and reached for intimidation as a final weapon. Caleb pressed harder. Dean's cheek ground against the floor. And then in the noise and the violence and the chaos of the broken cabin, Caleb's vision went white. Not from a blow. From inside. The floor beneath him became dust. The cold air became heat. The sound of the storm became the grinding thunder of a collapsing wall, and the scream of his own name through a cloud of debris so thick it turned day to darkness. He was back. In the alley. In the rubble. The girl's face appeared small, and dust-covered eyes, wide hands reaching. He froze. His muscles locked. His breath stopped. His grip on Dean loosened by a fraction that should have been too small to matter, but was not. Dean felt it instantly. He wrenched sideways, half freeing himself. His elbow caught Caleb in the temple. The world tilted. Caleb's hands opened. The cabin swam around him. And then, a sound. Small, warm, close, a whimper, followed by the sensation of a tiny wet tongue against the knuckles of his right hand. River. The puppy had crossed the cabin floor on legs that shook so badly they could barely hold him. He had walked through the broken glass and the overturned furniture and the terrifying chaos of violent men fighting in a space too small for violence, and he had found Caleb's hand, and he was licking it. Not frantically. Gently. With the slow, deliberate persistence of a creature that understood in whatever way a 6-week-old animal understands anything that the man on the floor needed to come back from wherever he had gone. The dust cleared. The alley disappeared. The girl's face faded. And the cabin returned. The fire, the storm, the cold air rushing through the broken door. Dean Garrett scrambling to his feet 3 yards away. Caleb's hands closed. His vision sharpened. His breathing steadied. He rose from the floor the way a man rises who has just been given a reason to stand. Not from training, not from duty, from something smaller and warmer and infinitely more powerful than either. He caught Dean in 2 strides. The technique was clean precise and executed with the kind of controlled force that ends a confrontation without escalating it. He locked Dean's arms behind his back, drove him to the floor, and held him there with a pressure that communicated without ambiguity that movement was no longer an option. Dean struggled once, then stopped. He lay on the floor of the cabin, breathing heavily, snow melting in his beard, pale eyes staring at nothing. "It is over," Caleb said. Behind him he heard a door open. The back door. Maggie. He almost called out to stop her, but her voice was already moving away from the cabin, already outside, already carrying through the storm with a clarity that defied the wind. She had not waited. She had moved during the fight, slipped out the back, into the blizzard, to the place where her phone could find a signal strong enough to carry 3 digits. Her voice when she spoke into the phone trembled, but it did not break. "This is Margaret Hale. I need help at Caleb Mercer's cabin on the old lumber road past the covered bridge. Dean Garrett is here. He brought someone with him. Please come now." The response was lost in the wind, but Maggie stood in the snow with her silver hair whipping around her face and her shawl soaked through and her hand steady on the phone, and she did not move from that spot until she heard the dispatcher confirm that units were on the way. Because this was the woman she had decided to become. The one who walked toward the fire. The one who refused ever again to stand at a window and watch. The cruiser arrived 14 minutes later, red and blue lights muted by the heavy snowfall pulsing through the white like a heartbeat made visible. Sheriff Warren Braddock stepped out first, a large man in his late 50s whose patience was legendary and whose tolerance for certain individuals was not. Officer Rachel Kincaid followed, moving quickly to secure the associate who was still slumped against the doorframe. Dean was pulled to his feet and cuffed with the efficient, practiced motions of officers who had done this before and expected to do it again. He did not speak. His pale eyes moved across the cabin one final time, taking in the fire, the blanket, the dog, the puppies, the man who had stopped him, the old woman who had called for help. Then the officers guided him through the broken door and into the storm. Kincaid returned to the cabin and opened the rear of Dean's truck. What she found inside stopped her in the doorway for a full 3 seconds before she called for the sheriff. Steel traps of various sizes, heavy chains, leather collars fitted with numbered metal tags, a ledger bound in dark cloth, its pages filled with handwritten entries, dates, numbers, locations, amounts paid and received. The documentation of an operation that had been running in these woods for years. Braddock looked at the ledger, then at Caleb, then at the dog lying on the blanket with 2 puppies pressed against her and a numbered collar resting on the table beside her. "Mercer," the sheriff said quietly, "you may have just broken something a lot of people have been looking for." Caleb did not respond. He was kneeling on the floor beside Willow. His hand rested on her neck. Her pulse beat against his palm. Steady, present, alive. River sat in his lap, small and warm and trembling. The puppy who had walked through broken glass to bring a man back from the darkest place inside himself. Outside, the cruiser doors closed. The engine started. The red and blue lights pulled away through the storm, taking Dean Garrett and his associate, and the ledger, and the traps, and the collars, into a system of justice that would eventually do what justice does, when given sufficient evidence and sufficient time. Maggie appeared in the broken doorway. Snow covered her hair, her shawl, her shoulders. Her face was drawn with cold and emotion, but her eyes, her pale blue eyes, were steady. "Is it done?" she asked. Caleb looked at his hands. They rested on Willow's neck and on River's small back. They were not shaking. For the first time in 3 years, his hands were not shaking. "It is done," he said. The days that followed the arrest of Dean Garrett moved through Millersfield with the slow, deliberate rhythm of water finding its level after a flood. The storm broke on the second morning. The clouds thinned and separated, revealing a sky so blue it seemed impossible the same atmosphere had produced the violence of the previous nights. Sunlight fell across the hills in long golden shafts that turned the snow into a field of diamonds, and the pines straightened under the warmth, releasing their burden of ice in slow, glittering cascades that sounded, if you stood still and listened, like applause. Caleb Mercer did not stand still. He had not stood still since the night the cabin door broke inward and the world demanded that he become once again the man he had spent 3 years trying to leave behind. The cabin bore the scars of the confrontation. The door had been repaired with planks from the woodshed, fitted and nailed with rough competence. The window nearest the entrance had cracked a single fracture running diagonally across the glass, like a river drawn on a map no one asked for. The floor still held faint marks where boots had scuffed and bodies had fallen. Sheriff Warren Braddock came to the cabin on the third day after the arrest. He arrived alone, his cruiser parked at the end of the lumber road, and he walked the remaining distance through the snow with his hat in his hand, and an expression that Caleb had learned to associate with men who carried news that was both good and complicated. They sat at the repaired table with coffee that Caleb made on the old percolator. Braddock spoke carefully, in the measured cadence of a man who had spent 30 years delivering information to people whose lives would be altered by it. The ledger recovered from Dean's truck had been analyzed by the county prosecutor's office. The entries dated back over 4 years. Names, locations, prices paid and received. Dogs acquired through theft, through purchase from unsuspecting breeders, through capture using the network of traps laid throughout the forests of northern Vermont. The animals were bred in a facility on a rural property owned by an associate of Dean's on Route 9, the same property Maggie had referenced during the confrontation on the porch. Puppies were sold through channels that extended into 3 counties. Some went to private buyers. Others went to operations that the ledger identified only by initials and dollar amounts, but which investigators believed were connected to organized fighting rings operating across the state line. 47 numbered collars had been accounted for in the ledger. 47 animals that had passed through a system designed to extract value from living creatures until the cost of maintaining them exceeded the revenue they produced, at which point they were disposed of. Some were released into the wild to die. Others were not released at all. Caleb listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup with both hands and felt the warmth of it against his palms, and thought about the collar on the table upstairs. Number 41. Willow's number. The number that meant she was 6 entries from the end of a list that documented years of suffering conducted in silence in the forests of a place that most people drove through without stopping. Braddock set his cup down. Garrett is being held without bail. The prosecutor is building charges on multiple counts: animal cruelty, theft, operating an unlicensed breeding facility, interstate trafficking. He paused. The ledger is the centerpiece. Without it, most of this falls apart. Caleb nodded. He already knew what was coming. The dogs are evidence, Braddock said. All 3 of them. Willow the puppies. The prosecutor's office has contacted County Animal Services. Standard procedure for cases involving animals connected to criminal evidence is to transfer them to a certified holding facility where they can be examined, documented, and maintained as part of the evidentiary chain until the case resolves. The words landed in the cabin the way stones land in still water, quietly, with ripples that spread outward until they touched every wall. How long? Caleb asked. Could be weeks, could be months. Depends on the trial schedule, the defense strategy, whether Garrett cooperates. Braddock met his eyes. I am sorry, Mercer. I know what these animals mean to you. But if the chain of custody is compromised, the defense will argue contamination. And if the defense wins that argument, the ledger becomes inadmissible, and Garrett walks. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room when 2 men understand each other perfectly and wish they did not. Caleb looked across the cabin. Willow lay on her blanket by the stove. Her leg was healing. The swelling had reduced. She could stand now briefly on 3 legs and had begun to take tentative steps across the cabin floor with the careful testing movements of an animal relearning its relationship with gravity. Her coat had been cleaned and brushed, and in the firelight, it showed the rich, deep patterns of black and tan that had been hidden beneath the ice and dirt and suffering of her days in the forest. Her amber eyes were clear now, calm, alert. The eyes of a dog who had begun cautiously to believe that the worst was behind her. River was asleep on Caleb's boot. He had developed this habit over the past 3 days, claiming whatever footwear Caleb was wearing or had recently removed as his personal sleeping territory. His small body rose and fell with the easy, unguarded breathing of a creature that had found safety and was not interested in analyzing whether it would last. Scout sat beside his mother with his chin on her paw, watching, always watching. His dark eyes tracked every movement in the cabin with the steady, patient attention that had earned him his name. But there was something new in those eyes now. Something that had not been there on the night of the suitcase, or the night of the boot prints, or the night the door broke inward. It took Caleb a moment to recognize it because he had not seen it directed at him by any living thing in a very long time. Trust. Complete, unconditional, absolute trust. Caleb set down his coffee. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at the dogs. He looked at his own hands resting on the table, steady, still no tremor visible in the firelight. He could keep them. He could tell Braddock that the dogs were his now, and that no one was taking them from this cabin. He could refuse to cooperate with the evidentiary process and keep Willow and River and Scout here in the warmth beside the fire where they had finally begun to heal. No one would blame him. The town had already heard the story. The man at the gas station had nodded at him yesterday with a respect that Caleb had not asked for and did not know how to receive. Eleanor Finch at the post office had pressed a bag of dog treats into his hand, without a word, her eyes saying everything her voice did not. He could keep them. And Dean Garrett's lawyer would file a motion to suppress, and the ledger would become contested, and 47 animals would remain numbers in a book that a judge might never see. Or he could let them go. He could hand over the 3 living creatures that had pulled him out of the darkest winter of his life, and trust that the system he had once served would do what systems do when given sufficient evidence and sufficient courage from the people who feed them. The choice was not between love and law. It was between holding on to what he needed and releasing it so that what had happened to Willow could never happen to number 48. Caleb stood. He walked to the blanket. He knelt beside Willow and placed his hand on her neck the way he had placed it on the first night when her pulse was weak and her breath was fading, and the only promise he could make was that he would try. "You are the bravest thing I have ever known," he said quietly. "And I need you to be brave one more time." Willow looked at him. Her amber eyes held his, and in them Caleb saw something that he had been searching for without knowing it, the reflection of a man who was capable of doing the right thing even when the right thing cost him everything he had rebuilt. He picked up River. The puppy woke, yawned, licked Caleb's chin, and settled into the crook of his arm with the boneless, absolute trust of a creature who had no concept of goodbye. He gathered Scout, who came willingly, but paused to look back at his mother, then at Caleb, then at his mother again, as though triangulating the geometry of a situation he could sense was important, but could not fully comprehend. Officer Rachel Kincaid arrived at 2 in the afternoon with a transport vehicle fitted with heated compartments and soft bedding. She was quiet and professional and handled the dogs with a gentleness that told Caleb she understood what she was taking and what it was costing the man who was giving it. Caleb carried Willow to the vehicle himself. She did not resist. She leaned into him the way she had leaned into him on the ridge, with the total silent surrender of a creature that trusted him beyond the reach of fear. He placed her in the compartment. He placed River beside her. He placed Scout on the other side. The puppies pressed against their mother. Willow's eyes found Caleb's through the open door, Amber holding steel blue, holding it the way a hand holds another hand across a distance that is about to become uncrossable. Then Kincaid closed the door. Caleb stood in the snow and watched the vehicle pull away down the lumber road. The sound of the engine faded. The tire tracks filled slowly with fresh powder. And then the clearing was empty, and the cabin was empty, and the silence that settled over both was the particular devastating silence of a space that has recently been full of life and is suddenly completely not. Maggie found him on the porch an hour later. She did not speak. She sat beside him on the step and placed her hand on his arm, and they sat together in the cold two people who understood loss well enough to know that it does not require commentary. It requires company. "You did the right thing," she said finally. "I know," Caleb replied. And he did know. And knowing did not make the cabin less empty, or the silence less heavy, or the absence of a small paw on his wrist at 2 a.m. less painful. But it made him, for the first time in 3 years, the kind of man he could look at in a mirror without turning away. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. 6 weeks after the night the cabin door broke inward. 4 weeks after Dean Garrett entered a guilty plea on 11 counts in exchange for testimony that led investigators to the breeding facility on Route 9 and the network of buyers in 3 counties. 3 weeks after the facility was raided and 14 dogs were recovered, malnourished, frightened, and alive. The envelope was plain white. Official. Return address from the County Animal Services Division. Caleb opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in one hand and a stillness in his chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but the particular breathless space between the two where a man stands when he knows that the next 30 seconds will determine the shape of his life going forward. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph stated that case number 2024 CR 4471 State of Vermont versus Dean Robert Garrett had been resolved. All evidentiary holds on animals associated with the case had been released effective immediately. The second paragraph asked Caleb Mercer whether he wished to file a formal petition for adoption of 3 German Shepherd dogs currently housed at the Braddock County Animal Services facility. The animals were identified as follows: adult female tag designation 041, assigned name Willow; male puppy approximately 12 weeks, assigned name River; male puppy, approximately 12 weeks, assigned name Scout. Caleb read the letter twice. He set it on the table. He placed both hands flat on the wood surface, and he sat there for a long time in the quiet cabin with the fire burning and the morning light falling through the window in long, warm stripes across the floor. Then he picked up his keys. The drive to the facility took 40 minutes. The roads were clear. The snow had begun its slow retreat from the hills, pulling back from the lower elevations, first revealing patches of brown earth and the pale green beginnings of things that had been waiting beneath the surface for permission to grow. The sky was high and blue and limitless in the way that Vermont skies become in early spring when the weight of winter finally lifts and the air fills with something that is not quite warmth, but is the memory of warmth, the promise that it is coming. Caleb parked. He walked to the entrance. A woman behind the desk looked up, recognized his name, and led him down a corridor lined with kennels toward a room at the end of the hall. She opened the door. River came first. He came out of the kennel at full speed, a blur of black and tan and frantically wagging tail, and he launched himself at Caleb with a force that knocked the man back a full step. His paws scrambled against Caleb's chest. His tongue found every available surface of skin. His entire body vibrated with a joy so total and so uncontained that it seemed to overflow the boundaries of his small frame and fill the room with something warm and electric and impossible to resist. Scout came next. He walked, deliberately. He crossed the distance between the kennel and Caleb with the measured, careful pace of a dog who wanted to be certain that what he was seeing was real before he committed to believing it. He stopped at Caleb's feet. He looked up. His dark eyes held their question for exactly 2 seconds. Then he pressed his head against Caleb's hand and held it there, and his tail moved once, twice, 3 times, and that was enough. That was everything. Willow came last. She appeared in the doorway of the kennel and stood there for a moment silhouetted against the light behind her. She was larger than Caleb remembered. Or perhaps she had simply been too diminished by starvation and injury the last time he had seen her for her true size to register. Her coat was full and rich, brushed to a shine that caught the overhead lights and held them in warm bronze and deep black. Her injured leg bore a slight limp that the veterinarian had told him might never fully resolve, but she stood on it and she walked on it, and she crossed the room on all 4 legs with the dignity of an animal that had earned every step. She walked to Caleb. She sat in front of him. She looked up into his face with amber eyes that were clear and calm, and held within them the specific luminous quality of a creature that has been through the worst thing that can happen and has come out the other side and has decided with the full weight of that experience behind the decision to trust again. Caleb knelt. He placed his hand on her neck. Her pulse beat strong and steady against his palm. She pressed the crown of her head against his chest and held it there, her weight shifting forward with the quiet certainty of a creature that has chosen its person and does not intend to choose again. He drove them home. The cabin had been repaired. The door was new, built from cedar by a man in town named Harris, who had heard the story and refused payment. The cracked window had been replaced. The floor had been sanded where the scuff marks and the glass fragments had left their traces. Maggie had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the table, the kind she collected in summer and kept through the winter months as proof that color existed even when the world insisted otherwise. Caleb opened the truck door. River leaped out before the vehicle had fully stopped tumbling into the remnants of snow that still lingered in the shaded patches beneath the pines, rolling and barking with the uncomplicated ecstasy of a puppy for whom the entire world was a gift that required no wrapping. Scout descended more carefully, sniffing the ground, checking the perimeter, verifying that the cabin and the clearing and the forest beyond it were exactly as he remembered before, allowing himself to relax. Willow stepped down last. She stood in the clearing and lifted her nose to the air and breathed deeply, taking in the scent of pine and wood smoke and the particular mineral smell of snow in the process of becoming water. She walked to the porch. She climbed the steps. She crossed the threshold and entered the cabin and walked directly to the blanket beside the stove and lay down on it as though she had never left. That evening, Caleb did something he had not planned. He retrieved the old leather suitcase from the corner where it had sat since the day he brought it back from Highway 42. It was battered, cracked at the edges. The brass clasps were tarnished. The surface still bore the shallow scratches of tiny claws that had clung to it in the cold. The thin red string still hung from the handle, frayed and faded. He opened it. The interior was empty, worn fabric lining cold and bare. He folded a soft blanket and placed it inside. He lifted River, who squirmed with delight, and set him in the cushioned interior. He lifted Scout, who submitted to the relocation with dignified tolerance, and placed him beside his brother. The two puppies circled once, twice, and then settled into each other with the practiced ease of creatures who had spent their first night alive, pressed together on this same surface, in this same case, in a very different world. The suitcase that had been a place of abandonment became a bed. The object that represented everything that had been done to them became the place where they chose to rest. Maggie arrived as the light was fading. She came through the new door carrying a basket that contained biscuits and honey and 2 knitted scarves, one forest green, one cream, and a small blanket woven in soft blue thread. She placed the scarves on the table. She draped the blue blanket over the edge of the suitcase where the puppies slept. She sat in the chair by the window and took up her knitting, and did not say anything for a long time, because the room was full, and the fire was warm, and the silence was the kind that does not need to be filled. Caleb stood on the porch. The evening light lay across the clearing in shades of amber and copper. The forest stood tall and quiet beyond the yard, the pines beginning to release their winter posture, their branches lifting slightly as the weight of ice diminished day by day. The creek behind the cabin was running again. He could hear it. A faint, persistent sound beneath the larger silence of the hills. Water finding its way downhill through channels carved by years of repetition. The sound of something that never stopped moving forward. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear River snoring in the suitcase. Scout's nails clicking on the floor as he repositioned himself. Willow's slow, steady breathing. Maggie's knitting needles tapping together in a rhythm as old and as comforting as a heartbeat. Maggie spoke from inside the cabin. Her voice carried through the door, softly settling into the evening air like the last note of a song. Some things do not get lost, Caleb. They just wait for the right person to come. He did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in the cabin behind him, breathing and snoring and clicking and knitting and being alive in a space that had been empty for a very long time and was not empty anymore. He looked down at his hands. They rested on the porch railing, open, relaxed palms turned slightly upward as though receiving something invisible from the evening air. They were the hands of a man who had carried a dying dog out of a frozen forest and had carried 2 frightened puppies off a frozen highway and had carried himself finally out of a frozen place inside his own chest that he had believed would never thaw. They were not clenched. They were not braced. For the first time, he could remember they were simply there, doing nothing, needing nothing, holding nothing except the railing of a porch that belonged to him. The light faded. The stars appeared one by one above the tree line, the first stars of a sky that was clearing after a long winter distant and bright and patient, the way all true things are patient when they are waiting to be seen. Inside the cabin, a fire burned. A dog slept beside it. 2 puppies dreamed in a suitcase that had once been the worst thing that ever happened to them and was now the safest place they knew. A woman knitted by the window, and a man stood on the porch of his grandfather's cabin and breathed the cold, clean living air of a Vermont evening, and understood for the first time since a wall collapsed in a village far away that he was home. Not because he had arrived somewhere, because he had finally stopped running. And if you are still here, if you have walked this road with Caleb and Willow and River and Scout and Maggie from the frozen highway to this quiet porch, then I want you to know something. The miracles that matter most do not arrive in blinding light. They arrive in small, trembling forms. In the whimper of a puppy on a frozen suitcase. In the courage of a mother who drags herself through a steel trap to lead danger away from her children. In the steady hands of a broken man who decides on a winter morning that he will not drive past. They arrive in you. In the choice to stop, to look, to care, to stay. If this story touched something in you tonight, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And if you believe that no act of kindness goes unnoticed, subscribe to this channel so these stories can find the hearts they were always meant to reach. May you be blessed. May you be protected. And may you always remember that even in the coldest winters of your life, small miracles are already on their way to find you.